Welcome. This is a two-part talk on the U.S. military in Sonoma, California, 1847 to 1852. Part 1 is the 1st New York Volunteers, who were in Sonoma in 1847-1848. They were otherwise known as Stevenson's Regiment. On April 4th, 1847, Company C of the 1st New York Volunteers arrived in Sonoma. They were the most unique U.S. Army regiment in American history, in that they were formed and recruited to conquer, occupy, and colonize a foreign country. That foreign country being the northern Mexican province of Alta California. Throughout the time between 1847 and 1848, there were 71 soldiers in Company C that were posted in Sonoma. They had an indelible impact on Sonoma and California, especially considering this was the formative years of Northern California, or at least the beginning of the Americanization of California. And this is their story. So the topics I'm going to talk about are some background on the Mexican-American War and how that was the impetus for forming the 1st New York Volunteers. Then the formation of the regiment, who were they, their journey and arrival, life in Sonoma, desertions, mustering out, and some specific highlights of or individual soldiers who stayed in Sonoma and California that had a significant impact. So first of all, it's important to have a timeline to look at the major events that were occurring regarding the 1st New York Volunteers. So we start with 1846. In May 13th, we had the declaration of war, in which the U.S. declared war on Mexico that started the Mexican-American War. Soon after, we had the Bear Flag Revolt in Sonoma, where a group of 33 settlers attempted to overthrow the Mexican government of Alta California, and starting off in Sonoma and ultimately declaring the California Republic. On June 26, 1846, the regiment was formed in New York City. The regiment departed New York City for San Francisco on September 26. En route, on January 13th, the Treaty of Cahuenga was signed. That treaty ended all hostilities in Alta California. April 4th, Company C arrived in Sonoma. In 1848, January 28th specifically, gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill, which is about 100 miles away from Sonoma. Just a few days later, on February 2nd, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed by the United States. This treaty was to end the Mexican-American War. Although it was signed on February 2nd, it still needed to be ratified by Mexico and the U.S., which would occur later in the summer. Around May 30th, Company C was ordered to Mexico for occupation duty. And August 15th, they were mustered out, which ended their service to the Army. So in 1846, Oregon and the Mexican province of Alta California were quite significant. When we think of the current California border, the northern Mexican province of Alta California was much larger. If you see the red line to the right, that was the northern Mexican province of New Mexico. And Oregon was obviously larger than it is today, but Oregon country was secured by the United States in the Oregon Treaty in 1846, just before the Mexican-American War. May 13th, 1846, we had America declared war on Mexico. And why was this? Well, it all stems from manifest destiny. You can sum this down to its most simplest concept, and it's that it was Americans' God-given right to occupy the land between the sea and Shining Sea, the Atlantic and the Pacific coast. The problem with achieving this was that California was in the way, because that was a foreign country. And declaring the war, it was an offensive war. Mexico was a non-belligerent nation. They didn't do anything. In fact, the United States went into disputed territory to provoke the Mexicans to attack. And once they did, the president declared that American blood had been spilt on American soil, which was incorrect, but it didn't matter. He was able to secure a declaration from Congress. So this was the first offensive war. It was a naked land grab. That's all it was. Mexico didn't do anything. The other reason why it was very controversial, the Mexican-American War, is that there was legitimate concern that most of these, should the U.S. prevail, most of the new lands would be in the South. And the defining controversy that ultimately split the country apart was slavery. And during this antebellum period, the period before the Civil War, everything was a balance between free and slave states. So if all this, and the slave states were in the South, free states were in the North. So there was thought to be a balance between Oregon and Texas, so slave state, free state. But all these new territories, because they're in the South, they may be slave states, which would upset the balance and the balance of power in Congress. So that was the two reasons why it was a very controversial war. President James K. Polk was very clear in his election and his practices. He wanted California. So the strategy for the Mexican-American War is that there would be three armies. The Army of the West by Brigadier General Stephen Watts Kearny would go through, capture Santa Fe and then end up in San Diego. Another army in the North, Scott, would go to Veracruz with an amphibious landing and go up to Mexico City. So there was all that happening. But the true, one of the important aspects was to capture California, but also to secure it. And so the decision was to recruit a volunteer regiment to conquer, if necessary, occupy, and colonize Alta California. Because even if the army did secure it, you needed to somehow keep troops there, or loyal citizens. And you have to think about how far California was from the rest of the United States. So this is briefly regular army versus volunteers. Regular army, the professional army, was a very small army, and they would enlist for 5 years. Volunteers would enlist typically for 1 year or the duration of the war, whichever was shorter. Also, volunteers would tend to elect their officers, except the commanding officer, but the various lieutenants. Regular Army didn't do that. Regular Army was much more disciplined, and volunteers not so much. So the regiment was formed by Colonel Jonathan D. Stevenson. He was a colonel in the New York State militia. He had no military experience. It was a political appointment, and that was very common back there. This was during the time of the spoils system, that whoever was the leader would select all the posts, and this was before the creation of the civil service. Stevenson was well connected. He was a New York City politician. He had served in the New York State Assembly. He was an assistant to the former governor of New York and remained so with that governor, who then became the vice president of the United States under James Monroe. He knew the Secretary of War, William Marcy, so he was very well connected. And we're not quite sure if he asked or he was asked to form this regiment, but he ended up agreeing or volunteering, not sure, but he was the person to do it. It gets a little confusing, especially if you're doing historical research. It was initially formed as the 7th Regiment of New York Volunteers. But what happened was there was going to be 6, when they declared war, because the federal or regular army was very small, they would call out to the states to fill all these regiments using their well-regulated militias was the focus. And so New York they asked him to do 6 regiments, and the 7th regiment, which was Stevenson's regiment, was unique, and it had a very different mission. It was considered separately. But what happened was, for whatever reason, there were not 6 regiments that were filled. There was bits and pieces, but there wasn't enough. And so they combined them all into a regiment, and they were called the 1st Regiment of New York Volunteers. But what happened then was the War Department changed the name of the 7th Regiment, Stevenson's regiment, once they were in California, to the 1st New York Regiment of Volunteers. The partially organized regiments that was called the 2nd New York Volunteers was redesignated as the 1st New York Volunteers. However, and this happened in 1848, Colonel Burnett ignored the orders, and he's always considered his regiment the 1st New York Volunteers. I know it's a little confusing. The point is, if you do research, basically you'll find 2 1st New York Volunteers, even though they were very different. So it's just a kind of a pride thing. So in June 1846, the recruitment began. So Stevenson submitted newspaper notices and put up posters to recruit soldiers for his regiment. He opened up 6 recruiting offices in New York City and 3 in the Albany, New York area. And these notices were not just in New York, but there were some in Boston and Philadelphia. And the criteria for enlisting in his regiment was you had to be over 18, you had to be single. There was an exception to that, though. There were a few that were men that were married, and they were allowed to bring their wives, in that their wives would become paid laundresses with the Army, which was a standard approach with the U.S. Army back then. But instead of 1 year or a time, they were required to serve for the entire duration of the war. And what's really interesting is they were told, and this was the policy, they'd be given no transportation back. And the point here is because if this is going to be a colonizing regiment, you can't give them a means to come back. It's a way to force them to colonize. And Stevenson really wanted settlers, because if the real goal was to settle, you needed some trades and important skill sets so you can have a self-sustaining settlement, because it was so disconnected from California. I mean, from California was so disconnected from the East Coast and the Midwest, for that matter. So why enlist? There were multiple reasons. One of the driving important factors is economic. So traditionally, volunteers would volunteer for duty more for patriotism and not economic. But this was a unique regiment. This wasn't just going to fight and they were done. It was really going to settle and be there permanently. So in the late 1830s, there was a series of financial crises that rocked the U.S., especially some of the northern states, including New York City. And this created a depression. And with the depression, you had downward pressure on wages, and you also had increased unemployment. And you have to think about, during this time in the 1840s, there were no social safety nets. There was no unemployment insurance, no Social Security, no SNAP or food stamps, Medicaid, any of that. There was none of that. So if you did not work, you did not get paid. And you did not get paid, you were in a tough situation. Also during this time, there was 1.7 million new immigrants to the U.S. in the 1840s. The vast majority of these were from Ireland and Germany. So in the early 1840s, the Irish were escaping Ireland because of the potato famine. Basically starving, no food, minimal employment. And the other key group was the Germans, who were also escaping economic crises, but there was also revolts, political crackdowns, religious persecution, all these aspects. So they were driven primarily from economics to get away, or lack of food. And so if you coming to New York, which was the main port of entry, and there's already high unemployment, lower wages, adding these new immigrants was actually putting more downward pressure on wages and increasing unemployment. So facing unemployment and no prospects, this would be one of the reasons why some of the individuals decided to enlist for California. There was also the growing nativism movement of the 1840s, which was anti-immigrant and especially anti-Catholic. This was a strong party or strong movement that ultimately grew into a short-lived but strong party called the Know Nothings in the 1850, just anti-immigrant. And there certainly was the adventure aspect. So in looking at the factors, you have to think about it from a push-pull. For some, the push to get away from something had a certain level compared to the pull going to something. So some people had more push to get away. Some people had more pull. It was really on an individual level. But there was the adventure aspect. So John C. Fremont, he was in the Army. He was doing explorations in the Rockies in California. His second and third expeditions were in California. He would write up the reports, but it was his wife, Jessie Benton Fremont, who was an excellent writer, and she was able to help craft these into more sort of a selling point for Manifest Destiny, the adventurous aspect. And she helped create the persona of John C. Fremont as the Pathfinder. In addition, Thomas Hart Benson, who was Fremont's father-in-law, was one of the most powerful senators. He was a senator from Missouri and a vocal advocate for Manifest Destiny. And he had the reports printed by Congress, and excerpts were published all over. So the point is, to some degree, there was the adventure, but there wasn't actually that much known about California at the time. And there was just bits and pieces. And probably what they did know came predominantly from Fremont's writings, or certainly his wife's writings. So who were Company C? Company C its recruiting office was in New York City. At the time of enlistment, the average age was 27, which was higher than typical. The median age was 25. The youngest was 18. The oldest was 48. So I say the youngest was 18 with an asterisk. We know that individuals that were underage were enlisting, but it was easy to do that because there was no identification card. You just told them how old you were. And the oldest was 48. So this is hard to imagine. Imagine 1840s, you're 48 years old and you decide to enlist in the Army to go far away to a foreign land. And 48 seems kind of old now to do that, but in the 1840s, a 48-year-old, it's not the same as today because of the life expectancy and so forth and so on. So that's pretty amazing. So the birthplaces of those that are known, 50% of the company were foreign, with Ireland being number one and Germany. And of course, New York was, as one would expect, the most frequent place for native-born recruits to have been. That was their birthplace, or that's where they claimed they were from. So there was a broad range of known professions. There was only one farmer, and Stevenson specifically tried to recruit farmers. But since the recruiting office was in New York City, you're not going to get many farmers. There were various skilled and unskilled. There was a carpenter, a mechanic, a cobbler, a painter, just a little bit here and there. What's interesting is there were 3 physicians, and all 3 of them had to enlist as privates. But what's really interesting is there's 9 printers. So during that time, the printing trade was really adversely affected by the economic depression and so forth. And the printers didn't just print stuff, letters or posters, but a lot of them were involved in printing newspapers. And newspapers were the only form of mass communication back then. So this was an important skill. And what's also interesting is on the journey to California, the carpenters and mechanics, some others, were allowed to bring their own tools, but printers were not allowed to bring a printing press or type. So it's just, yeah. So this is their dress uniforms. It was actually designed by one of the majors in the regiment. This is the only known color depiction we have of their uniform. And during the antebellum period up through the early part of the Civil War, because volunteer units were formed from the state and their commissions came from the state, they were really state regulated, but they were folded into the regular army in a command structure. They had their own uniforms. And you would see lots of different uniforms, so there was no uniformity in the uniforms. And the first New York Volunteers, the dress coat or the dress uniform for the officers was what they call a skirt coat. Dark blue, went to just above their knees, with gray pants and a shako style hat. The enlisted was very similar, except they had a short jacket instead of the skirt coat, so a short coat. What's interesting is the uniforms were actually, Stevenson had a tailor arranged in New York City to produce the uniforms. Now, one of the issues is the uniforms wore out. That's just out of normal wear and tear. And we know that, it was, as I'll talk about briefly, it was a 6-month journey to get to California. And then when they got there, they were on their own. There was no supply depot. There was no logistics system. There was none of that. They were on their own. So as pieces wore out, they were lost, they would adopt semi-military, semi-Mexican articles. So the point of that is the picture I just showed you about their uniforms. That's probably what it looked like during the first couple months. But then they soon change because of the necessity of replacing bits and pieces. There's actually stories of some of them, some of the individuals, especially during the summer, would wear serapes. So privates were paid $7 per month because they were an infantry regiment. That was the pay. Mounted soldiers would get $8 per month. In $24, that's about $3,400 per year. On top of that, they did get food, shelter, and half their transportation. They also got a $12 per year clothing allowance. They had to buy their own uniforms. And with that money, they would also have to buy replacements or whatever they had available. The other thing that's interesting is that, so they would get paid usually twice a month. They would line up and the paymaster would be there, and they were in theory going to get $14 per month, but standing right next to the paymaster with a laundress. So the laundresses were soldiers' wives. And whether you used their service or not, you had to pay. And they would wash your uniforms. And they typically, around this time, got paid about $1 a soldier per month. And the standard ratio was about 1 laundress to 20 to 25 soldiers. Not sure exactly. We know that there were 2 laundresses, at least in Sonoma. There likely was a third, but have not discovered who that person is yet. So what does that mean? They're getting paid far more than their husbands that were enlisted. So they were getting paid anywhere from $15 to $23 per month, which was a substantial income comparatively. And they often would also get food and shelter and so forth. But just an interesting aspect. And certainly it was hard work. So Stevenson chartered 3 merchant ships: the Lou Chu, Susan Drew, and Thomas Perkins. This is the Lou Chu, which Company C was on. There was 3 1/3 companies on the Lou Chu. In addition to, there was some couple wives, family, crew, and equipment. It was crowded. These were not large boats, so there was about probably close to 270 total on each ship. Again, they were relatively small. They sailed from New York City to San Francisco. This is not an accurate depiction because the Luchu and the others, because of the winds at that time, had to go to the Cape Verde Islands. In fact, one of the diarists on board notes that they could see the Cape Verde Islands, which is off of the west coast of Africa. And then they would hook into South America. They stopped at Rio de Janeiro. And then as they survived going around Cape Horn, they stopped at Valparaiso, Chile. They stopped both times to get some fresh supplies, water, so forth and so on, give the soldiers a little bit of break. At both places, some of the soldiers took far too much liberty as they never came back to the ship. So there were about, amongst all three ships, 50 some odd desertions. It's also not, that's 13,000 miles nautical, so it was anywhere from 15 to 18,000 miles, and it was about 183 days for the Luchu. So they arrived in San Francisco in March 1847. This is an interesting lithograph of what Yerba Buena, or it just had changed its name to San Francisco, looked like. There was very little there. And what's interesting is in this lithograph, we actually have a picture of the Luchu. The two ships next to it are the Thomas Perkins and Susan Drew, and it puts it in perspective of the other ships. So these were not large ships, but it's just interesting that this lithograph shows the three of them arriving in San Francisco, March 1847. En route, the Treaty of Cahuenga was signed on January 13th, 1847. As I mentioned, that treaty ended all hostilities in Alta California. That also means that they originally had to conquer, occupy, and colonize. They no longer had to conquer. So that was done. So they just had to occupy, and should the U.S. Prevail in the Mexican-American War and they are awarded Alta California, then they would colonize. So it's interesting, Private Roderick Morrison, he's a poet, he's aboard the Luchu, and upon arriving in San Francisco, this is kind of the last couple lines of his poem. When first I landed here, I thought a paradise to see, but oh, my luck, you have turned out a wilderness to be. So the thought here is during that 6-month trip, which was brutally long, kind of boring, they had some entertainment on board, but they had a lot of time to think about California and probably slowly conjured up this incredibly romanticized vision of the land of milk and honey. And when they got there, there just wasn't much there at that time. So Company C was posted in Sonoma. The orange triangle there is Fort Sacramento, otherwise known as Fort Sutter, and I'll talk about that briefly, but a significant number of those from Company C did go there. The rest of the companies were spread out. So H and K stayed in San Francisco. Company D and I went to Monterey. Company A, B, and F went to Santa Barbara. And Company E and G went to Los Angeles. Over time, 2 companies transferred to San Diego because there was increasing hostilities there. And then 2 companies actually went to Baja California for occupation duty, in which there was some fighting. But Company C did not transfer out of there. So they arrived on April 4th, 1847 in Sonoma. Company C did. There was only 67 at that time. There was only 2 officers, a captain and a lieutenant, 62 enlisted, 2 hospital stewards, which were the physicians, and 1 drummer. Because they no longer had to conquer, their mission now was to protect settlers and property from indigenous peoples' attacks and then punish those engaged in attacks. So they were stationed, or their quarters were at the Sonoma barracks. Sometimes it's called Fort Sonoma or Camp Sonoma, but that's what the barracks looked like in 1851. And just to the right is the mission. And to the left was General Vallejo's home, Casa Grande. which burned down in 1867. So the soldiers lived upstairs in shared bunks. One of the issues is when they got to California, there was no furniture, there's no supply depot, there's no lumber production. But what they did use is the packing crates that were used to pack all the materials and goods and materiel shipped over with them. And there was a lot because they knew once they got to California, they'd have to be self-sustaining for a significant period of time because there was no supply depot. So there's lots of crates, so they used them to build bunks and footlockers. The married soldiers stayed in tents, and the hospital was a tent. And the commander took what's called the soldiers' room in the bottom of the barracks and put wooden plank flooring and some other upgrades to it. So from 1847 to 1848, the total force fluctuated, was about 48. All these numbers represent end of the month reports, and they had various, it fluctuated a lot because there was expeditions, there was temporary duty, so forth. There are no reports for June, July, and August 1848, which is why that's blank. So again, 67 arrived on April 4th. In May 1847, 26 were on detached duty or temporary duty to Fort Sacramento. And then April 1848, much later, 22 were sent to San Francisco. So Fort Sacramento was basically a disaster. In 1847, one private drowned. Either malaria or typhoid fever broke out. It's unclear. But what happened was 10 of the soldiers returned to Sonoma. Later on, the officer, Lieutenant Charles Anderson, was just too sick. He was ultimately sent to San Francisco for convalescence, where he died. There was one corporal, one of the last to leave. He was just too sick. He was brought by boat, which is how you got from Fort Sacramento down to Sutter. At some point, he died in the boat just outside of Sonoma. They're not sure when or where. He was brought to Sonoma where he's buried, but we do not know where he was buried. So in 1847, about 200 people lived in the greater Sonoma area. There were some Americans that were already there, so there was some cultural exposure to Americans. But thinking about 67 New York City-based soldiers arriving at one time with this small number, and they were centered right in town, how that would have changed the culture, and they certainly changed the gender and racial composition. And we know that they were generally welcomed in that there were at least 3 letters published in San Francisco newspapers extolling the benefits of Company C, as far as they've really helped advance the development of Sonoma economically, buildings, it's cleaner, there's more culture, that's sort of going on. Some of the Californios welcomed them. Not sure, how universal that was. But generally, that's with all reports, is they were generally pretty welcome there because they were fairly well behaved. Now, these soldiers saw indigenous and Spanish-speaking Californios for their first time. And of course, they were all white because blacks, even if they were free, were not allowed in the army. And in New York City in the 1840s, there was probably very few non-white immigrants that were there. And if there were, it's not clear they would be allowed to join the army based on the policies back then. And there certainly were cultural exchanges in that they adopted some of the local California customs, which were Mexican-based, and so forth and so on. So based on some reports, some letters, the duty was minimal there. There was 1 drill per day. There would be work assignments. It was reported as being relaxed and pretty loose discipline. In fact, one of the corporals, Corporal John Cameron, talked about how he would do his 1 drill, and if there was work duty, he would hire someone to do the work for him, like another soldier, and then he would leave for the day, which was right next to the barracks, and just work on his house. Now, he probably could afford to hire someone because his wife was one of the laundresses. And they recreated. We know they hunted, they played billiards, they gambled, and like a lot of the soldiers back then, they drank heavily. They also had a theater there in Sonoma. So California's first theater, so Monterey, Sacramento, Los Angeles have put out claims that they're the location of the first English-speaking theater in California, but it was definitely Sonoma. And Company C had 2 New York City amateur actors. We know that they and some other members of Stevenson's regiment on a couple of the transport ships acted plays, did performances, and so forth. In September 1847, in Sonoma, they put on their first play, The Golden Farmer. This was a 2-act drama. Basically, a farmer wants to increase the size of his farm, so to do that, he does crimes. The second act is when the crimes catch up to him, what happens. So it was a very popular play in the 1840s. And all evidence points that the theater was in Salvador Vallejo's building. The name of the theater was the Colonnade. And what we know regarding the theater is soldiers made rough-hewn benches. They built some box seats on the side of the theater. They decorated the inside of the theater with branches and such, and they used blankets for the curtains. They put up posters and hung up lamps on the outside, and they did charge admission, and the actors split the admission. In addition to those 2 actors, there was actually a third one that they used. He was a young private, and he was noted as being clean-shaven, and so he was tapped to play the female roles. So gold was discovered in January 24th, 1848, about a little less than 100 miles away at Sutter's Mill. But it wasn't until March 15th, 1848 that the first public announcement. There were some rumors swirling, but it was printed in the San Francisco newspaper. And as one can imagine, this discovery upended the town and challenged the soldiers. So all around Northern California, any able-bodied man and young male took off to the mines. But the soldiers couldn't do that because that would be desertion. Which leads me to what I call the soldier's dilemma. So March 1848, we have the announcement of gold. And now there's rumors of a peace treaty. So the peace treaty was signed in February by the United States, but it had not been ratified. But it was just inevitable. And remember, they had to serve there in the army until the end of the war. There was no time limit. So as soon as that is done, they're out. So on May 1848, Company C is ordered to go to Mexico for occupation duty and potential, fighting. So you can imagine this is like the worst possible thing. Gold's right over there. You want us to settle. We're about to get out. The war's about to end, and you're sending us far, far away from the gold. This is just really unbelievably crazy. So now looking at desertions from 1847 to 1848, prior to June 1848, there was only one desertion. And a couple of reasons why. One, there was no place to go. Any of the major settlements had army units there, so you're not going to desert to there. The other thing is life was pretty good. It was okay. You're just biding your time, and a number of them wanted to stay in Sonoma. So why desert? There was no place to go. There was nothing else to do. It just didn't make sense. But with the discovery of gold, rumors of the peace treaty in order to Mexico, we saw a huge slug of desertions. There were 36 recorded desertions, which is a 50% rate. The standard desertion rate for the U.S. Army at this time was about 15.5, 16% in that area. 17 of them were caught. So soldiers caught deserting, they were returned to the service. They had to go back. They were sentenced with 49 lashes, a loss of back and current pay, branded with a D on their left hip, and were given a dishonorable discharge. If that happened, that meant no land bounty warrants. So the soldiers were given land bounty warrants, which were acreage set typically in the Midwest, and that was their land, they could move there or they could sell it for cash. And later on, much later on, Congress decided to give Mexican-American war veterans pensions, but they were not allowed to get the pensions. So these were the standard sentences. It's unclear how many of the individuals were given a branding or 49 lashes. But the records do support that they were given a dishonorable discharge, and some applied for land bounty or pensions, and they were denied because they had deserted. So just looking at the June aspect, they were ordered to Mexico sometime in late May, we're not quite sure, and then desertions just started. And they departed from Monterey on June 10th, in which they were going to go by bark, and from there they were going to combine with another company and then travel to Alta California. But they got there and they didn't have enough soldiers, and they were told, no, it's just too small. Just go back to Sonoma. And they returned and arrived in Sonoma on July 15th, 1848. So on August 5th, while still in Sonoma, Company C was ordered to go to San Francisco. They were ordered to go help the customs agents collect customs. August 15th, there was 46 soldiers in the company who were mustered out. Meanwhile, Company H, that was in San Francisco, was ordered to go to Sonoma, and then they turned around and came back and were mustered out. At this point, as of August about 25th, there was no more military in Sonoma, and there would be none until May 1849, with the arrival of the regular army, which is part 2 of the talk. So the final tally, there was 71 posted in Sonoma. There was 1 death in Sonoma, 4 transfers into Company C from other companies. At Sutter's Fort, there were 3 deaths. And then there were 19 active desertions, which means 19 deserted and never got apprehended or caught. So after mustering out, most of them went to the gold fields. But 17 did return to settle in Sonoma. And here are some of the individuals. I will say there were some other soldiers that settled in Sonoma, including A.C. McDonald, Thaddeus Leavenworth, who was the regimental chaplain, and John Frisbee. John Frisbee is well known. He married Vallejo's eldest daughter, and then proceeded to basically financially devastate Vallejo over a number of years. So we have Captain Johnny Brackett. He was the commander of Company C. He was a lawyer by training. He became a member of the California State Assembly, the first one in 1849, and became an acting district attorney for Sonoma County. Private Peter Campbell, he was one of the physicians, so he was a hospital steward. He became a justice of the peace in Sonoma between 1850 and 1854, a mayor, then an alderman, notary, and coroner. We have Private William Fuller. He was the last alcalde of Sonoma before it switched to the mayoral system. We have Corporal John Cameron. He deserted and never was apprehended. He's also the only one we have a picture of or likeness of. He became Sonoma's first mayor in 1850 when it became a city for the first time. And later he became a merchant. We have Private A.J. Cox. He deserted in June but got caught. He started the newspaper, the Sonoma Bulletin, in June 1852. He was one of the printers. The Sonoma Bulletin was the first newspaper north of San Francisco. That lasted until about 1855, and then he started other newspapers in Napa County, then Healdsburg in northern Sonoma County, and then the Mendocino Beacon in Mendocino County. We have Private Henry Conrad. He deserted and was apprehended. And he purchased a lot in April 1849. So he must have done some okay in the mining. And so Henry Conrad is interesting. He was from Germany. He was 20 years old when he enlisted. So at this point, he's about 24 years old. And he marries this woman called Asoy, otherwise known as Achoy or Atoy, in May 1850. So it's unique on multiple levels. First of all, it was, talking about Atoy or Asoy, she was the second Chinese woman to arrive in California. She arrived in San Francisco in 1848. On the ship, on the voyage over, she was married. Her husband died at some point, and she struck up a relationship with the captain of the ship, and he showered her with gifts. So when she arrived in San Francisco, again, foreign culture, there were not many Chinese there, and certainly, she was the second woman. Her husband died, very different language, everything like that. She goes into prostitution. And what's really interesting is there's all these stories and articles about her. She ultimately became probably the most famous prostitute of that time, is that men would line up and pay just to see her, look at her. And they commented just her stunning beauty and all these incredible compliments. She did that for a while, and then she became a madam. And she was very successful. So this is the strange part. Why would one of San Francisco's most successful madams in the height of the gold rush go to Little Sonoma and marry Henry Conrad, a 24-year-old German who we don't know if he was wealthy or he did okay, not sure. It really doesn't make any sense. So it is a big mystery. We know that she didn't stay in Sonoma very long. There is no record of their divorce, but we know that she did find a new lover. In 1851, her name surfaces again. So in July 1851, you have the San Francisco Committee of Vigilance, which was a vigilante committee, very well organized, because there was just lawlessness, absence of justice and police. And so Citizens Committee created this to institute law and civil order in San Francisco. In 1851, they also decided to crack down on brothels, and Asoy's new lover was the chief inspector for the San Francisco Committee of Vigilance for brothels. In 1852, we know that Henry Conrad was a merchant. Private Silas Higgins, he purchased lots in May 1847, which is significant because they just got there in April. So he must have had some money with him. Lots were selling for $9 a lot. So he saw something there early and purchased a lot. He deserted, never got caught. He's a founder and co-builder of Sonoma's famous Union Hotel. He's a co-builder in that he started it and ran out of money and ultimately had to secure two different partners at different times to help finish the construction. He was a member of the Sonoma Town Council in 1851. Private George Story deserted, did not get caught. He was the second co-partner of the Union Hotel, and he was the road overseer, the master of roads in Sonoma County in 1877. Joseph Dow, similar, deserted but got caught, co-partner of the Union Hotel, and he became a member of the California State Assembly in 1862. There were a variety of other soldiers who stayed that we don't have much on them, but they had either purchased lots or we just know that they stayed in Sonoma. There's a few other Sonoma-based soldiers that stayed in California but didn't stay in Sonoma. We have Corporal Thaddeus Ames. He was a physician, one of the hospital stewards. He was a physician for the Mendocino Reservation and became a member of the California State Assembly in 1862. Second Lieutenant Theron R. Purley was a Justice of Peace in San Francisco, a member of the State Assembly in 1849, and a county judge in Santa Cruz County. Private William Johnson, he became the alcalde of Monterey, the first county clerk of Monterey County, and the assistant clerk of the California State Supreme Court. So the last family I want to talk about is the Roos family. To me, they're just an incredibly interesting family in that it was a 12-member family from Germany. So they immigrated from Germany, and the patriarch of the family was Christian. He was a jeweler, a silversmith by training. One day, he and the entire family were out watching a parade. I believe it was Andrew Jackson's funeral parade. They were out there, and someone or individuals broke into his jewelry shop, stole all the jewelry, cash, valuables, stripped their house. They reported that the value was $20,000 in 1846. In today's dollars, that'd be about $850,000. So a huge hit. He hated New York City at this point because he felt he achieved the American dream. The city let him down. The police let him down. It was a horrible place. Did not want to be there at all. So at 45 years old, Christian and three of his sons enlisted all as privates in Stevenson's regiment. So Christian and one of his sons did serve in Sonoma. The other two sons served in another company. So after mustering out, Christian moved to San Francisco. His eldest son went to the gold fields, and he did come with his wife and other children, so they all moved with him to San Francisco. And he did a couple things. One, he started purchasing lots in San Francisco. And so this is 1848. This is before the gold rush. And he started a jewelry/gold assay business. So this is an important skill set. You know, what's the gold worth? Here's your money. So it was really a critical business. At this point, he started the Roos family empire in that those lots, which he paid around $12,000 for, because of the explosion growth in San Francisco, they were selling for about $35,000 in $1849. And he purchased numerous lots, and he started building shacks and renting them out because housing was such a scarce resource. He also built Roos's Garden in 1853, which was the first amusement park. This is amusement park / 19th century. So it was a private park. You would walk in there, you pay an admission, but they had various aspects, a beer garden, they'd have shows, you could rent it out, you could just relax. And public parks were also a huge scarcity in San Francisco because the land was so valuable. They didn't want to use it for parks or anything like that. It was for housing. So he was able to make a fair amount of money off that. In 1861, he actually died, Christian, in 1857, but his sons and wife were still pretty prominent. They built the Roos House Hotel, 3-story hotel, which became one of the leading hotels in San Francisco. It was destroyed in 1906, and they replaced it with a 3-story office building. They took that down, and in 1927, they built the Roos building, which was the tallest building in San Francisco until 1964. And it was also the first building with an indoor parking garage in San Francisco. So he was able to do the American dream twice, and his family were just incredibly wealthy. And it wasn't because of it was indirectly because of the gold, but it was because of real estate. His eldest son, Adolphus, did go to he was a member of the California State Assembly in 1868, founding member in San Francisco Fire Department, and he and his brother Charles, who was also a private, were pallbearers at Colonel Stevenson's funeral held in San Francisco in 1894. So, if you think about it, for this regiment, it was a once-in-a-lifetime unknown gamble. They had the differing levels of push and pull. They just wanted to get away and maybe, do okay. And gold changed it all. For some, it didn't change it much. Some were not successful. Others were wildly successful, especially those that became merchants and were involved in real estate. It did provide 17 settlers in Sonoma. If there wasn't gold, perhaps that would have been a higher number, but it was still a significant influx of permanent pioneering settlers predominantly from New York. And this included actors, public officials, merchants, and citizens. And they certainly had a significant influence on the development of the town as well. And these are the New York volunteers posted to Sonoma between 1847 and 1848. And thank you. So if you have any good historical leads that might add to this story, or if you have any questions, feel free to reach out.